Hello everyone, this is Akshat. I'll be giving paper on presentation on information seeking by software development developers with visual impairments. These are the authors. Moving on to the next slide. Now, motivation for this work is to increase accessibility in coding for developers with visual impairments, focuses on supporting interaction with development tools. Broadening access to programming skills is important for ensuring that these opportunities are equitably distributed and attainable for all members of society. The opportunities afforded by programming skills may be particularly important for people with visual impairments who currently experience significant economic inequalities. Now, these people might also benefit from support in information seeking. However, there is no analogous body of work examining the information behavior of DWVI. Proposed solution here. Conducted observation and detailed interviews research session remotely with 12 developers with visual impairments to explore the information behaviors. Each research session consisted of two sections. One is observational section and second is in-depth interview section. Compared finding against previous studies of developers with no specified visual impairments, information behaviors, and recommended for designing non-technical information sources. Next slide. We recruited 12 developers with visual impairments by contacting the list of people who are interested in participating in the survey of our research, and we created a table with the job description, age, gender, visual impairment duration, and other assistive device. Move on to the next slide. Now the work evaluation of the proposed solution. So in order to include this study, participants needed to indicate that they regularly use screen readers to access digital device and write or modify source code as a part of their professional work. Conducted all sessions remotely as teleconferencing using teleconferencing software, primarily due to local social distancing mandate. Now moving on to our next slide. Now the procedure. In this, we have two sections: an observational section where participants were asked to share a window on their screen over the teleconferencing software and to perform a predefined task which require navigating online API documentation for open source Go programming language to find a package and function given for a specific criteria, and an in-depth interview section where they used to use these observations to scaffold a longer conversation in in-depth interviews. They adopted an approach to interviewing based on the critical incident technique. This technique asked participants to recount a recent or eventful time in which they were engaged in the behavior of interest software development. Moving on to the next slide. So on this slide, we will discuss on the analysis of the research. So each session was and video recorded and transcribed in fully by with reputable third-party transcription service. With these transcripts and notes, they accepted each passage in which participant indicated using a specific information sources, and then conducted an inducive qualitative analysis which consisted of three steps: classified all excerpts into categories describing the type of information source discussed, and developed open source to describe individual participants' use of each type of information source, developed thematic codes from these open sources to describe commonalities in the use of each type of information sources across participants. Finally, codebook containing thematic source and representative codes from participants shared with the other members of the research team who reviewed them for accuracy and clarity. After reviewing the codebook separately, the team member need to discuss and confirm agreement together. Moving on to the next slide. Now the contribution and findings. Now participants discuss 7 types of information sources outside of source code and IDEs, official documentation, blog and tutorials, forums, and textbook, functionally restricted as information sources. These are there were strong commonalities in participant description of the use of strictly informational sources, typically expressed in terms of technical depth and depth of the information provided, the prior knowledge required to use them. Information sources were alternatively functional, had highly specified users, so their utilities were conceptualized differently than other identified information sources. Moving on to our next slide. Found that information sources our participant use were highly those which were used by developers with no specified visual impairments. Found similarities in the types of accessibility issue identified in technical information sources and those which are commonly in non-technical sources. For instance, visual elements lacking proper textual description, inappropriately nested or missing heading tags, and link whose purpose cannot be determined from context are each issue of the non-compliance with established web content accessibility guidelines. It was also noted that these studies is explanatory in nature and future research should be conducted to confirm these similarities. Additionally, since the technical information sources discussed were non-compliant uh, with the web content accessibility guidelines, it is possible that higher level issues were not discussed by or were not apparent to our participant considering more fundamental issues. Moving on to our next slide. Now the questions we are left with is that it is possible that high level issues were not discussed due to fundamental issues. Now the messages we got from the paper, we compared our finding against previous studies of developers with no specified visual impairments, information behavior, and recommendations for designing non-technical information sources. Despite many superficial similarities, examining development as an information seeking process highlighted the role of contextual and social factors in determining the overall accessibility of the development process. Collectively, collectively our findings suggested that even in the high technical domain of software development, understanding accessibility requires attending to contextual and social factors outside of ID. Moving on to our next slide. Thank you. Any questions?